Okay, let's bring in Stephen now. Stephen, Larry Palmer has talked about the low morale of the Venezuelan army and alleged there's a link between the Venezuelan government and Colombian guerrillas. Ambassadors are normally expected to improve relations between countries, not to damage them. So why, even before arriving in Venezuela, Palmer did start to cast stones at Venezuela? What do you think?
Well, I think that his comments are quite interesting because they're really almost the antithesis of diplomacy in some ways, which is rather interesting of a diplomat. The interesting thing about it, I think, is that just recently, in fact in August, Juan Manuel Santos, the newly elected president of Colombia, had got together with Chavez, and this was after 2 years in which there'd been frozen relations between the two countries as a result of basically accusations being thrown across the frontier from one country to the other about the fact and the idea that Venezuela was harbouring some terrorists in Venezuelan territory. And what had happened as a result of the new election and Juan Manuel Santos coming into power in Colombia, there was a sort of a thawing of the relationship between the two countries, which was, I think, rather interesting. They met in Santa Marta, they had a very cordial meeting, and as a result of that, only in November, Chavez had actually delivered and given up 3, apparently, terrorists to the Colombian government as a gesture of goodwill. So, in other words, he was trying to say, look, I want to work with Colombia. And in fact, the interesting thing is the argument here is, and it's specifically said by Larry Palmer to the Senate committee, he said that he's very worried about those very close links between between the government, high-ranking officials in the Venezuelan government, and the terrorists. And the intriguing thing is this only was, you know, that this sort of new gesture actually only happened in November. So it's quite funny, really, that he should have made these comments at this particular point in time. One would have hoped that he would have liked to move forward with this possibility of a thawing of the relations between the country. But it may well be he'd been told, no, let's have a firm line on this, and we don't want to go, we don't want to sort of negotiate at this point and just draw a line in the sand. And I wonder if that's happened. And I do wonder if it's as a result of the rather, again, another undiplomatic comment made by Chavez, in which he said we were, had great expectations, but the US President, Barack Obama, has the same stench as Bush. Now, that's a very personal comment, and I wonder if some of that has led to this breakdown.
Right, Sarah, the fact that the Colombian issue was raised here, well, the issue of US bases in Colombia was a dispute between the two sides. It led the two countries to recall their ambassadors in 2008 through 2009. What do you think of these allegations made by Larry Palmer here?
Well, they're really intended and calculated to destabilize relations in Latin America between Colombia and Venezuela. And it once again shows that U.S. policy in Latin America and toward many countries is not for peace and stability. U.S. influence is only strong and powerful when the countries it's seeking to dominate and control are unstable. And so any reconciliation, any improvement in relations between Colombia and Venezuela would be to U.S. detriment, and certainly to the detriment of the U.S. military presence in Colombia. All these years it's been described as an effort to control drugs in Colombia. Of course, it has nothing to do with the question of drugs. It has everything to do with stopping a popular movement in Colombia from becoming a force such as has happened throughout Latin America, where democratic and popular forces have really swept elections and made enormous transformations and changes. The U.S. very much fears that in Colombia, and they fear any warming of relations on any measure and scale between Colombia and Venezuela. And all of this is calculated again and again to subvert the changes that are happening in terms of the economy in terms of the people themselves having more of the resources of their own country.
Okay, let's bring in Peter as well. Peter, do you think this, the Colombian issue is part of a smear campaign to put pressure on Venezuela?
Well, I think it is. I think one of the reasons that Larry Palmer probably said what he said at his confirmation hearings is that he was trying to play to the right-wing Republicans in the Senate whose votes he needed for his confirmation. That's why the statements may have been relatively extreme. I do think that this issue that Professor Hart raises of the rapprochement from President Santos is probably an important factor in this, because it is a sharp departure from the attitude of his predecessor, President Uribe, towards Chavez. And I'm sure this really set off alarm bells in Washington when it appeared that Colombia, who they had been able to count on to really stand up to Chavez, was now looking like they were willing to cooperate with him. And so I think this really does reflect a strategy that involves provocation and perhaps, to keep a permanent disruption of diplomatic relations as a warning to other countries in the region.
Okay, Stephen, in London, we know that Chavez has already challenged the US with a complete cut-off of diplomatic ties. Which side do you think will bear the brunt of a complete halt of diplomatic relations?
Well, I don't think that I'm not really sure that it will lead to much. I mean, it could just be a spat. I think the interesting thing is whether it escalates beyond that, because I think it's really to do with trade, isn't it?
Well, that's the thing. The issue is if the US is dependent on Venezuela concerning the oil supplies you just said, so it is concerned that it will bear the brunt of these cut-off of relations, won't it?
Well, actually, if it was diplomatic, if it's only diplomatic, I think that's one thing. If it's economic, I think it would be disastrous for Venezuela. I mean, Hugo Chavez has on many occasions threatened to cut the oil off. But I think it would be pretty bad for the US. In other words, it would lead surely to an increase in the price of oil. But at the same time, I think it would be quite disastrous for Venezuela. They need to find new buyers. One wouldn't want to think, of course, that it would lead to any repetition of what happened to Cuba when the United States decided in the early 60s to cut off its buying sugar. I'm sure it's not the case. But what I find interesting about this is it's almost as if Hugo Chavez wanted this to happen. He said, "Do this if you dare." And I think this is one thing that one would really think twice about saying that kind of thing to the United States. It's almost as if he wanted this to happen, and it's as if he wanted to see this as a way of gaining more prestige in the world among those people who see the United States as a bit of a bully in that area.